Well, hey everyone! Welcome to episode 361 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I had a wonderful conversation with wildlife and conservation photographer Peter Mather. Peter is based out of Whitehorse in the Yukon and uses camera traps to capture absolutely mind-blowing photographs of grizzly bears, wolverines, and caribou. We talk about his passion for these animals and the steps he's taking as a photographer to tell the important stories that these magnificent creatures have to tell. Before we record, I want to quickly thank our latest supporters of the podcast over on Patreon. Patreon is the only means through which I am able to monetize this podcast, so your support over there helps to ensure that the show continues to bring you new content week after week. Thanks to Taryn King, Alexander Jones, Scott Hacker, and William Stevenson for your generous support. If you would like to help keep this content coming to you week after week, like it has since 2017, please head over to patreon.com/fstopandlisten or find a link in the show notes. Okay, let's get to this week's episode with Peter Mather. All right, Peter Mather, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. I'm looking forward to catching up.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had your name on my list of people to reach out to for quite a long time now, and so I'm excited to finally meet you virtually.
Yeah. It's I listened to a couple of podcasts, so it's pretty cool when you listen to something and then you get to go on.
Yeah, right on, man. Well, for people who aren't familiar with you and your photography and your work, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm from like Whitehorse, Yukon, northern Canada, so like in the far north of Canada. The Yukon's about the size of California, but we have 40,000 people here, and so I photograph like a lot of wildlife, wilderness, that type of stuff. A little bit of culture, like because we have a really strong like First Nation culture up here. I live with my family. I got 3 kids that are like home for Christmas with their boyfriends, so we live in a small house and it is packed. Yeah, so it's one of those Christmases that was like there's a little bit of tension at times.
All girls?
Yeah, so 3 girls, 25, 23, 21, 2 boyfriends, a cat, a dog, me and my partner.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
What about you? You got kids?
Yeah, I've got a 16-year-old son. Yeah.
Oh, nice. And dog, cat?
I have 4 cats.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it can get interesting here at times as well.
I was really curious to see about if you had dogs, because like one of the things I really want to pick your brain about that I do a lot of, and sounds like you do more of, is the hiking photography.
I used to have 2 dogs, but neither of them were very good for hiking. One of them was a pug, so he couldn't travel very far, and then the other one was a black lab border collie mix, and I guess I just didn't do a very good job of training her, because every time I would try to take her hiking, she would just run off into the woods and then never come back. So I just was like, I don't feel right taking her on hikes with me, so I just stopped taking her with me.
Yeah, I got the same issue. I was thinking it'd be great. I could like fill up his backpack with gear, but it doesn't work that way.
Right.
They can barely carry their own food at best, and then as soon as I do wildlife stuff, and like I go out and do the bear stuff. My dog, whose name is Luke Skywalker, yeah, he comes out and then he just chases anything he sees. It's just like doesn't work.
Yeah, I was gonna say having a dog and wildlife photography probably not a super good mixture.
Yeah. I got a friend who is a bear guide, and he's got a dog, and it's trained so well that like the dog will sit beside him. And if a bear is like 100 feet away behind them, the dog will just give a little low growl so he knows where it is. Like it's, but I didn't like, we got our dog as like a shelter dog, and so we didn't have a chance to train him. He was kind of already, so we never got around to doing that. But it'd be kind of handy if you could.
Yeah,
have a dog like that. Yeah.
That'd be awesome. All right, well, Peter, I'm always interested in learning about how people got into photography. So what's your story there?
You know what? I grew up like hunting. Like my dad was a hunter, but he was a really bad hunter, and so like it was his excuse to get out in the bush, and it's still his excuse. Like he goes out on like 30 hunts a year, and he usually doesn't get anything. Uh, and so I kind of, it was a good way to grow up because like, like it was very clear it didn't matter what we got. But I didn't like the hunting even at the, because every now and then we'd get something and I just didn't love it. It wasn't my passion. And so, but I loved getting out, and so photography became that outlet. I was like at university in a big city down south, and this guy from the Yukon who turned up and be my mentor, his name's Ken Madsen, and he came through and did a slideshow about protecting some of the Yukon wilderness, and it just captured just captured me, and like it changed my life. I was like, I dropped out of engineering that I was in. I went into teaching so that I could have the summers off and I could go exploring the Yukon and get into photography and like just kind of set me on my path, which is like environmental photography and conservation and telling important stories for the world.
Yeah, and how long have you been doing that full time?
Well, I was a teacher for a while, so I've only been kind of doing it full time for about 8 years. I ended up working like with Paul Nicklin for a little while. He was a
Yeah,
Nat Geo guy, and
yeah,
and so when I worked for him, I was like, oh, I really like this idea of like working really hard on like for 2 or 3 years on a story, and I just kind of like taken up that model of like finding stories, focusing on them for 2 or 3 years, and going from there. So that was the other kind of like after I worked with him for a bit, I quit my job but it was funny like when I was a teacher, I went from like teaching full time to I could like teach 0.85 time, and then I was teaching like one semester a year at 0.85 time. So I'm really like one third of a teacher. And then I'd be like, can I get a month off to go follow caribou in the Arctic? So I was like down to teaching like 2 months a year. I was like, it's time to leave. Those poor
right.
students. And then I would always have to call in sick for the games when my soccer team Arsenal played, um, soccer on TV. So I was down to very few teaching days in a year.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to pursue the type of photography that you pursue and have a career in something else.
Yeah, it doesn't work so much. What about you? Did you start in like did you kind of like slowly graduate like transition, or did you jump right in, or how did you? And you're mostly print sales, right? Is that your big business?
Um, I would say I definitely have done like a very, very, very long transition.
Yeah,
And pretty much like any other landscape or nature photographer, it's like an octopus, right? Like I have a
yeah.
little bit of income from writing, I have a little bit of income from selling prints, I have a little bit of income here on the side for teaching. So it's like you just kind of piecemeal things together until you have a pie that's big enough to put food on the table, basically, right?
Yeah, I'm in that same boat. That same boat. Do you find most of your like guests are like that? They have that octopus strategy.
Absolutely. I mean,
Oh, cool.
if you're full time in the nature wildlife space, I feel like you either have a sugar mama or a sugar daddy, or you have like like a trust fund that you got, or you've got like a million different things that you're doing in order to make it work.
No, that's cool. That's good to know. I didn't know if I was unique.
No, I think it's pretty normal.
No, that's good. That's good to know.
Yeah, well, and I wanted to ask you some more questions about the business side of things when we get further on into the conversation.
Yeah, me
But
too. I want to hit you on that too.
okay, cool. Well, I wanted to refocus us back on kind of your journey a little bit
Okay, yeah.
more, just so we can get a better understanding of kind of where you came from and all that stuff. So I know the focus of your work is on wildlife, on wilderness, and on the people of northern Canada and Alaska. And I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about how those different subjects are intertwined.
It's crazy. They're all like the same story. Like up here, anytime you're going to do wildlife, um, anywhere you go to do wildlife, there's First Nations people living there. Like I'm going to do salmon stories, or I go to do a bear story. Where do you find the bears? You find the bears where the salmon are. What else is where the salmon are? It's people. And so there's these areas where I go to photograph bears, and it's really neat because like you go to these creeks that are full of bears, and those animals have been living with the people for like 1,000, 2,000 years. So they're kind of used to each other. They know each other a bit. And,
Hmm.
and, and so the bears are really safe around where there's salmon, but also because they're getting lots of salmon to eat. But they've been living with people for 1,000 years, and so that makes you a lot safer. And sometimes I go up to the Arctic where you don't see like the bears and people aren't interacting forever, and the bears are very different. They're much more dangerous. But
Hmm.
essentially every story I go to do that's wildlife is like, there's First Nations people that are either there or we're there for 1,000 years, kind of living on that wildlife. So, you can't separate those stories in any way, which is great because it makes for like better stories. If there's like all these different components, the landscape, kind of like the economy and how they're going to balance like living off the land and having a healthy landscape, but also have jobs in the industry, and then and then the wildlife too, how the wildlife is like struggling kind of like everywhere in the world. And so that's always a big kind of shitty theme about stories too.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know that on your website, your work is broken down into what you call stories, kind of like what you're talking about, or like what I like to call just projects.
Yeah.
How did you come to focus your photography in that particular fashion?
Did you ever found like at some point in your career you were like up and down like, in terms of passion? Like you'd be all in for 6 months, and then for 6 months you wouldn't pick up a camera.
Oh yeah, like pretty much every year.
Yeah, and I was like that for like 3 or 4 years, and then I did that job, that National Geographic job, where I was like an assistant, and they were doing a story in the Yukon. I was working with Paul Nicklin, and I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to do like not just kind of shooting beavers for a week or a month. I want to do like a full 3 year photo story on beavers, kind of telling all the things about them. And as soon as I kind of like found that niche that I really wanted to do, I stopped having those ups and downs. And I'm just like, oh, I like doing these stories. And so some of the stories are long. Like I worked on a caribou story. It's been like 20 years. And then some of the stories are like, like I did a urban fox story. It was just like 1 year, but I just like going full in on a story and focusing it on for years and getting like, 200, 300 publishable images and maybe 20 really special ones. And that's what I love.
That's awesome. And how do you come up with the concepts for your different projects?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Like they all come to you differently. Like the urban fox one that I did, it was during COVID, and it was like the best time of my life because we had no real COVID up here. We didn't have any like danger, but everything was shut down. And so
Right.
all I did was like I walk my dog for like a couple hours a day, and I was walking my dog downtown one day, and I come across a angry fox, and so I go home. I'm like thinking about it. I was like, "There's probably a fox den around there." So I head down on my own. I find this fox den, and then I just ended up finding 20 fox dens in my town, and I just spent like months photographing all these foxes, and so like that's a nice and easy one. But there's other stories where I'm like, I think, oh, this is a really good story, and I do a week kind of doing some research and photographing it, and it doesn't like catch me, and then 2 years later I go back to it, and then 3 years later I go back to it, and then like in the sixth year I'm like I really get into it. It really grabs my passion. Like the ice bear story I'm doing, it was like that. I would do a little bit here, a little bit, and it just didn't get my passion. And like a lot of times I'd be out there photographing, and I'm like, I'm not enjoying this, so I'd go home and just kind of call it quits for the year. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, it just clicks, and all of a sudden I'm out there for like 4 months having a great time photographing every day and really happy. But for every one that happens like that, I've got another project where I've put in like 6 weeks in over like 3 years, and it just doesn't catch me. It's a great idea, I really like it, but it just doesn't catch me, and I just don't follow through. So it's like the projects are like that. Like sometimes it's like bang, and other times it just kind of slowly works in. So it's a real mix.
What would you say is the differentiator in terms of a project capturing you and you wanting to spend a lot of time on it versus something that kind of fizzles out?
I think there's probably a number of components. I bet you one of them is kind of my mental health. Like if
Oh,
I'm in a good mental space, then I'll be, like that's a good time to start a project and get going. And you just, my mental space is always up and down, like a lot of people. Like sometimes I'm just, and so it depends on that a little bit. Like if I'm in a really good mental space, or if things just start flowing for the project. Those would be the two biggest things. Like if things start flowing and you're getting the photos and it's really coming together, you found something really special. And then the second one is like, if you're in a really good headspace, things are going good in the world. If things are tough in the world, like say things are tough in your home or your house, your family, or like my projects, like I was teacher, right? So I'm in these high schools where it's like 300 teenage kids. Now, I have teenage kids at home, and they're kind of grumpy assholes. But but you stick them in a high school, you stick them in a high school where there's 300 of them, and they're just like positive beacons of energy, you know? So when I'm teaching, you're just surrounded by like 300 positive beacons of energy, and then I leave that to be a photographer, and I'm like out in these cold, dark places. I'm living in like a plastic camper in winter for a month in the north where you get like 5 hours of sunlight a day, and so it's like an entirely different like kind of mental zone. It can be really hard to get in the zone when you're living in a plastic camper heated by propane in winter, but especially when you contrast it to what I was doing as a teacher, where you get all this energy from the outside. And so, it can be hard to be motivated when you're out there. And so sometimes I'll give up and I'm like, I'm going to go to Thailand for a month and exercise.
I was gonna say, you sort of started to allude to this, but what are some of the things, as a full-time professional photographer, what are some of the things that impact your mental health in terms of you working on projects and having the energy to work on projects versus, just not feeling motivated?
Yeah, I imagine a lot of it has to do with my physical health. Like physical
Mm.
health has a big impact on mental health. So I remember I did that thing about Thailand. Well, like my wife and I, every year we go for about a month to Thailand, and there's this like place in Thailand. It's like this street that's like this entire like workout street. So it's all like CrossFit gyms, Muay Thai gyms, weight gyms,
Wow.
health food places, and we just go and we work out like 3 or 4 times a day, eat really well, and we're so tired we can't do any of the work you do on your computer sometimes, and so it just like gives us entire reset, and you get all this vitamin D. It's just great. And so like if my physical health is good, that's probably the biggest impact on my mental health. And then uh, I think there's other stuff that's out there too that impacts my mental health, but I probably am not quite like self-aware of what they are. So my best answer would be physical health for me, and then after that, I'm probably not sure exactly.
Yeah, I guess living up in the northern latitudes in the wintertime and well, spring and fall too, you're like you said, the daylight hours are shorter and shorter. I feel like that has to have some form of an impact on mental health to some degree.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. Like, and it's like it's physical too because, like in the summer, it's so bright, and like I can go to bed at like 1 a.m., get up at 6 a.m. and be full of energy. In the sun, you're just getting so much vitamin D because the sun doesn't really set. And then it's the opposite in the winter. Like I can go to bed at 10 o'clock at night and get up at 10 in the morning and be tired. And it's
Right?
still dark when I get up, and so that has a huge effect,
Yeah,
But
that's never fun.
I gotta hit up with you with a question or two. Like, what's your big project that you're working on right now?
Well, part of my problem is that I've got too many projects that I'm constantly
Yeah,
working on.
yeah,
But the big thing that I'm excited about that I haven't spent nearly enough time on yet, that I have a lot of energy for, I guess you could say, is
yeah.
this summer I did the Colorado Trail as a photographer. So it took me 35 days to finish the trail, and I climbed 30 mountains on the way, and I recorded a video every single day at the end of the day to kind of recap what I did that day, but then also kind of shared some psychological or
Oh
philosophical
wow.
concepts that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
came to me as I was hiking. My goal is to hopefully not only edit the videos I created and piece those together into some kind of, I don't know, something that makes sense for YouTube, but then also maybe there's a book or a story involved in that in terms
yeah,
of,
yeah.
like what, 30, 20 things I learned while hiking the Colorado Trail or something like that. I haven't quite put my finger on what that would look like yet. I think there's a story to tell there.
And what was your mental health during that trip? Like, was it just incredible the whole time, or was it up and down a little bit? Because like being so physical, that's good for your body and mind and soul.
It is. Going into that adventure, the biggest thing I was worried about was being alone
Yeah,
because I am definitely a people person.
Yeah.
And I got lucky because I ran into somebody pretty early on who had a very similar itinerary as me. So off and on, we would hike together a little bit, but then we would almost always camp kind of close by and hang out a little bit at night. So that was good for my mental health to have someone just to talk to. But yeah, I feel like during the trail, my mental health was almost always really, really, really positive. It
Yeah.
was only until after I finished the trail that my mental health went straight into the
Yeah.
toilet.
Yeah.
I had a really hard time getting back into society, and
Yeah.
the normal day-to-day life was like so much less exciting.
We, our family, we do these like 35-day trips, like all the time. And when you come back, there's a huge adjustment period, like big
Yeah,
time. Yeah. It's so nice being out in like for 35 days. It's so nice when you're like, you have so little decisions to make. It's like where to camp, what to eat for breakfast, lunch,
right.
and dinner. It's so great, like it simplifies life it's so good for your mind.
I know, because it frees up your brain, just is free to focus on whatever it wants.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we do some of these hikes, like we'll do a lot of like 2 week hikes. And up here where there's some of them are on trails, but a lot of them aren't on trails. You just kind of like find a route and you go. But it's like it's hard to carry gear. Like if you're doing a 2 week hike and you have to carry gear and food, like
Yeah.
was that an issue for you, or did you have a lot of cool stops where you could resupply?
No, it's pretty easy on the Colorado Trail because there's little towns on the way that you can resupply at. And I had pre-packaged and sent myself basically all of my resupply ahead of time, so
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
had to show up to these locations where my stuff was just waiting for me. And so, I think the most I carried at any given time was 7 days worth of food, which is
yeah.
still a lot, but it's not 14 days.
And what'd you carry for gear?
So my base weight was like 15 pounds, not including camera gear.
Yeah.
My camera gear was
Wow,
only
that's
like six
light.
pounds though. Yeah.
Wow, that's
So
crazy.
yeah, it was good. It was good. So then,
Oh
like,
man.
at the most I was carrying 40 pounds.
Yeah, we're going at 60 to 90 pounds.
No, that's rough.
Yeah. And what's your distance in a day then? You're probably going pretty decent, eh?
Yeah, I averaged 18 miles a day.
Yeah, we're averaging like 12 kilometers, so that's like 9 miles, 8 miles.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool, man.
Yeah,
That's
and
a
I had
lot.
some big days. I think my first day was 27 miles. Yeah.
And did you get like any career defining photos?
I got some photos I like, but I'm not
Yeah,
like
yeah,
super,
yeah,
super, super stoked about many of my photos. But,
yeah.
the photography was kind of secondary to the experience, so it's all good.
And do you find yourself like getting less career defining photos the more you photograph? I do.
Yes,
It's funny, eh?
absolutely.
Yeah. Like it should not work this way.
Well, I was gonna say that's actually something I haven't thought a lot about, but I feel like that has an impact on my mental health. Is every time I go out to make photographs, there's a lesser and lesser likelihood that I'm gonna come home with something that I'm really excited about, and
Yeah.
so it's becoming harder and harder for me to, I don't know, stay excited about making images. So I'm like having to figure out all these tricks to, like switching up the subjects I photograph, or maybe trying to focus on projects more succinctly, or, there's different things you can do to stay excited and motivated. But yeah, the good images that kind of are portfolio building,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
become less and less over time for sure.
Yeah, I find that for sure. I was just talking with a buddy like half an hour ago too, and we're finding we're doing less too. Like as a business grows and you have more success and you're making money and you're like not fighting for every dollar, you're actually photographing less because like the business takes up such a huge part of it as you get more successful. It's a really hard. I just ended up hiring my she just started like yesterday, my 25-year-old daughter as like my she's gonna start being like my TikTok social media manager, and then she'll go like build into like managing my business and selling stuff. So that's kind of cool. Hopefully it'll free up more time for me to photograph, but I'm worried it's gonna like free up less time. I'm just gonna be managing more and photograph. So that's a hard balance, man.
It is. I was gonna ask you, as someone focused on conservation and wildlife, what are some of the ways that you found to monetize your photography and stay afloat?
Well, like one of the big ways that's focused on that part would be like a lot of environmental groups are always looking for images. So I kind of sell them packages of like 30 images for 5 years use of for all these different things. And so that's probably like I would guess 10% of my business. That's pretty big. It also brings me a lot of attention for other business. Like what's interesting is like I'll invest a lot of money in my projects. Okay, like I did a project on Wolverines, and I invested like 50,000 of my own dollars in it. I just went out and did it. I haven't made my money back on it. Like I don't make my money back on something like that because the Wolverine photos, like my best ever Wolverine photo is like on top of this mountain. There's a Wolverine on top of a dead caribou, and it's like eating this caribou, and it's a really cool photo. But no one has ever bought it because like no one wants that on their website or on their wall, and I'm really proud of it. I really like it, but it's like something like no one's going to use. And so I don't always make money on those things, but I enter them in contests and I win a lot of awards. And then, like locally people hear about this, they read in the paper, they see it on the TV, and then people are like, oh, hey, I need to get a photo of a squirrel for my website. And the first person they think of is usually me. And so I kind of make my money back on all my projects, not through the projects, but just through like it brings like conservation groups to my attention. So they reach out to me and it brings attention to me. So people, when they think of wildlife stuff in my area, they're like, oh yeah, Peter made it. And then they come to me. And so that's like an odd, like, way of making money through conservation storytelling. Yeah, that's kind of cool.
It sounds like it's similar to me. Like, you have your fingers in all sorts of different things to just try to stay afloat. And then what I find is the more things you have your fingers in, the less time you have to actually get out and make images.
And you must be thinking about opening up a gallery at some point, right?
Oh, man, the brick and mortar, I don't know, man.
Yeah, you're
Maybe
not
if
sure, right? Yeah,
I feel like brick and mortar like really ties you to a physical
yeah.
location, and you have to deal with all of the logistics of, you probably have to hire staff. You're probably going to have to close on days that you're not actually there. I mean, there's lots of things that
Yeah, yeah,
it would be challenging to do. And then I feel like I don't necessarily live in the best location for a gallery, so I would have to move or something. So yeah,
yeah.
no, probably not.
It,
Not
yeah,
not in the near future. I could
yeah,
see
yeah.
it, maybe when I get older.
Yeah, I was just thinking because you're doing the prints and like that seems like is that the biggest source of your income, the prints, or is it not?
For me, I would say it's probably like a fourth of my income, something like that.
That's pretty big. Yeah, like 25%. That would be my biggest source if I had 25% of something. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's why I was thinking you might be interested in like setting up a gallery because when you focus on prints, like it's a big part of your business. That's a consideration.
it is. But the thing with prints is it's very, at least in my experience, it's very hit or miss. Like you'll have months where you might sell a ton of prints, and then you'll have other
Yeah,
months where you don't sell anything, and there's really
yeah,
no rhyme or reason to it. And so I feel like I've put as much effort as someone can put into trying to figure out how to do it, and it
yeah.
still sort of mystifies me sometimes. So
You know, what- you know
yeah.
what drives me crazy about selling prints is like I'll print out like five prints. I'm like, oh, like these are great, and like I think they're going to be popular, and like two of the five will be popular, and another three will be like like tumbleweeds, like crickets, like nobody's interested whatsoever, and you're like, what the heck? I really like this photo. I can't believe people aren't wanting to hang this on their wall. It's hard to
Right.
pick.
Yeah, no, it's always weird trying to figure out what people are actually interested in. I've definitely had some images that I don't really like that much that have sold, and
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah,
do I take that
yeah.
off my website? And it's like,
I
maybe I
know.
shouldn't. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
It's like
It's that.
it's like reflects badly on your style, your like your quality of your work, but it makes a lot of money.
I know, and it's like, I guess I have to keep it there, otherwise I'm gonna lose money. So,
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
yeah, the whole monetization thing of photography really forces you to make strange decisions. At least that's what I found.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
Well, you talked about the Wolverine images, and I spent some time looking at your Wolverine photos on your website. Some really amazing stuff. I feel like Wolverines are known to be kind of elusive and rare and kind of hard to find. What have been your secrets to finding them and to photographing them?
Oh, when I wanted to do a story like was hoping to do a story for National Geographic. So I thought, okay, what's impossible to photograph? I thought like, do you know Steve Winter's work on snow leopards?
Yes, I have seen some of that. Yeah.
Like, so he did that like 30 or 40 years ago, and nobody had even photographed a snow leopard before. And he comes out with these incredible series of camera trap images that just blew the world away, you know? And I was like, okay, I'd like to do that. What's something that nobody can photograph? And it was like wolverines. And I did a little research and I got like super lucky. Like just next door in Alaska, there's a bunch of scientists studying wolverines out on the Arctic coast. So I just gave them a call and they're like, yeah, we'd love to have you come out. And I spent like 3 seasons with them. They're biologists studying wolverines, and that kind of got the hang of how to find wolverines up there. And then I did another season on my own, and then I guided and helped out like a BBC Planet Earth crew. They're gonna have like a series on wolverines coming out, and like like I went from like wolverines are so rare. Like I'd seen in my life, I'd probably seen like 200 wolves. Like wolves are pretty rare. But I spent a lot of time looking for them, and in for 200 wolves, I've seen two wolverines. So like for every 100 wolves you see one wolverine.
Right.
And I got to the point where I was like up in the Arctic working with these experts, and I would see 20 wolverines in a season.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and I have a biologist, like one of my best friends from high school is a biologist in like the mountains just bordering Canada and US. And she's been studying wolverines for 8 years and she'd never seen one. Like never even seen one. Like full
Wow.
time studying wolverines. Yeah. And then we took her on a big trip up here, and she saw one on her trip up here. So it was kind of cool. But yeah, they're so elusive, and it was really cool to like work with these scientists, and we'd find these holes. Like there's no trees up where these wolverines are, so they just like they need these holes in the snow, and so they store their food in there. They hide from wolves in there. They have their babies in these snow holes, and so we were just like going around finding these snow holes and the wolverines that use them, and you get to know like the area the wolverines using and its territory, and just amazing animals. Like one of the coolest things we saw was they hunt caribou, and so like to hunt a caribou, one of the wolverines, he just followed, like chased a caribou. They're not fast, right? And caribou are fast. And so caribou can outrun them, but the wolverine would just keep chasing them. And he chased them for 35 miles until that caribou was just too tired that the wolverine could basically eat them. Like they're just crazy. That sometimes a wolverine will take down a moose. Now that the size is like a big wolverine is like 50 pounds, and a moose is like 1,000 pounds or 2,000 pounds. And sometimes a wolverine can. They say it's like if a house cat killed a deer. That's like the comparable ratio, you know? They're just crazy animals and they're so cool. And they have this reputation for being really vicious, but I never saw any of that stuff. Obviously they got to be pretty tough if they take down a moose, but like
Right.
there's never any danger from them. It was
I
a
mean,
really
they
cool
seem
project.
like they seem like total badasses. What is it about the Wolverine story that forces them to be so rare and hard to find?
And I don't know why they have such I think they're very sensitive to people stuff. So like in the South, like they're very much, they don't like people. They're kind of like grumpy trappers, like lonely trappers living out in the woods. And it's
So
funny because
they're
like
so they're smart.
yeah, they're very smart. Yeah, yeah. And I think that's what it is mostly is they don't do good with people, and so if people move into an area, they just move out, and they can't survive together, and then there's just they just don't reproduce very well, so they're so rare.
So it sounds like the sheer amount of land that we're taking up and the loss of wilderness from creating cities and roads and all of that, that's probably a primary driver for the endangerment of the wolverine.
Yeah, for sure. Like that's got to be the number one. And like other animals can adapt really well. Like foxes, coyotes, even bears to some degree, and wolves can even adapt a little better than wolverines. But
Hmm.
like definitely wolves and wolverines, they don't do very good living in proximity to people. They
So
struggle more than anything else.
correct me if I'm wrong, but you're using a lot of camera traps for your projects, and I don't think I've had any conversations with another photographer yet about the use of camera traps. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you set up a camera trap. What does that process look like? What's all involved in camera trap photography?
I do a ton of camera traps because, like, when you're photographing things like wolverines, I did a big project on that. My other big project recently was on these bears that get covered in icicles. And so, like, it's extremely rare things. And so, like, I did 4 years of photographing these bears that get covered in icicles, and I got some good photos, but I never once saw the animal through my viewfinder. It just really rare stuff to see. And like camera traps are like remote camera traps. Like, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do them, but there's essentially you have a sensor that senses movement and heat. And so you have this camera, you put it in a big like Pelican box and you place it somewhere, and then you have a camera that senses movement and heat and takes a bunch of photos. And so I typically tend to place a camera for out in the woods for like a week to 2 weeks, or a week to a month before I check it and change its batteries. And you know, you find a spot where, like a salmon creek where there's all these bears, you find a good setup, you put the camera there, and then you just leave it and you come back and change the batteries. And it's a way of getting like really like what you get wide angle photos with animals like bears and wolverines like really close up. So you're getting like a really unique perspective that I couldn't get any other way. And that it's hard to get of these like animals that are so shy. So for like wolverines, you're trying to find like an animal that's been killed by wolves. Okay, so like up in the Arctic, wolves will take down say a moose, and they'll eat part of it, but then the moose will get frozen solid, so it's hard for the wolves to eat the rest of it. Whereas wolverines are like specialized in kind of finding that stuff, and they'll find like a wolf will kill say a caribou. Caribou weighs say 500 pounds. A wolf will kill a caribou, and it'll take like the wolf will feed on it for a day, and then it'll freeze, and a wolverine will find it, and within a day, the wolverine can tear this caribou apart, drag it over to like 5 different holes and store it in these holes.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and then the wolves will come back and be really mad at the wolverine, obviously. And so, like, you know, with camera trapping, you can capture a lot of that stuff. Where if I'm just sitting there watching that stuff, it's really hard for that wolverine to accept me and not get scared off. So my camera traps give me a real opportunity to get stuff I just couldn't get. And plus, I can have like, you know, the most I've ever had is 14. I've had 14 cameras out, you know, trying to get something. So you have all these, you know, different things working at the same time. It kind of increases your odds. I got this one camera that my buddy made for me, and it's like half underwater and half above water. And so it's like a camera in one of these huge housings, and then it's got the remote sensor kind of sticking out the top. And so I spent like I was trying to get a photo of a bear in winter covered in icicles, you know, and I spent like 3 months this year working on that, and I never got it. I got close, but I never got it. And like I'm putting it on winter, so the temperatures are like minus 20 degrees Celsius, you know, and just freezing cold. I'm in and out of these creeks all the time, changing my batteries because that one I have to change my batteries like every 5 days. It was a tough go, and then it's like a tough go when you don't get it. It's like pretty depressing if
Yeah.
you don't get the shot.
How are you what kind of batteries are you using in order to do that? Because I know most batteries on a standard cameras, you know, you put it outside in negative 20 degrees, it's only going to last for 10 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, if you have like a Nikon D3200 with a little tiny battery, for whatever reason, those things don't use up a lot of battery, and I
Hmm.
can leave that camera out for a month, maybe two, with a tiny little battery and cheap camera. But if I want to use my Sony's, I have to like hook it up to a specially battery system with a bunch of like 9 volt alkaline batteries that are specifically designed for this kind of stuff. And then I can leave my stuff out for a month, sometimes 2 months, you know.
Oh
And
wow.
that's for like the mirrorless stuff. Just is so much more energy. But then, you know, you got a lot more variability. You can have a quiet camera, like that makes a big difference for animals. Like if you have that mirrorless, it doesn't make that clicking sound. Yeah, you know,
Hmm.
the animals are more comfortable. So, uh, yeah. So you just, it's a lot of money. Like one of my expensive camera trap setups is like $10,000 or $12,000. That'd be like like I wanted to get this photo of like a bear fishing for salmon in the middle of winter. He gets covered in icicles and have northern lights above him, you know. And so I need like 3 flashes, and it's like A7S3, I think is the low light one. Yeah, so it's the low light one, and then a good lens like a 20 mil f 1.8. So like it adds up, you know, adds up pretty quick. And Yeah,
Yeah.
and I just had one out and it just crashed too. It just died on me recently. I'll put up these cameras where the bears are in these creeks in winter, and the bears will come and just knock this camera over. Like I had one of these cameras knocked over, and it was still on shore, but then part of the river froze, and then it backed up, and you have all this like ice back up for like a half a kilometer. And so when I went back to pick up my camera 2 days later, it's under a foot of ice, and yeah, it's like I got to chop it out with the axe. The only thing that's left working on it is the memory card. I lost $5,000 in equipment. It was pretty sad. And then the memory card always has some garbage photo on it too when that happens. It's never had like
Oh, for sure.
world's perfect photo. Yeah.
So then, what about capture modes? You're photographing in variable conditions. So are you having
Yeah.
to set it up in like shutter priority, aperture priority? Like, what are your settings for something like that?
Well, you mix it up a lot, really. So, like in the summer up here, I don't have to use any flashes, which is very good. I don't like using flashes. I can just put it in aperture mode, auto ISO, and just let that camera do its work because, like,
Mm-hmm.
middle of the night, it can take a photo still. So that's like super easy. But in winter, it's super hard because, like, I want to get a photo of, say, a bear under northern lights. I got to have an exposure of like at least 2 seconds. Then I have to have these flashes. I have to make sure the bear's in the proper area so it doesn't like ghost. The bear like the flash goes off, then the bear moves, and you have the background kind of up here. And so in winter, it's a real balance. You're more in manual mode. You only have 5 hours of light in the day, and so you're kind of like not planning to get the photo in the day,
Got
and
it.
so it's really those are the two ways. And then you kind of just set it on like you're like, okay, what's the perfect photo? Is it a northern lights photo, so I go for long exposure, or is it just a photo of this bear reflected in a frozen pond, and so you go for like say 1/100th of a second at f8 or something like that, and you just leave it at that and do auto ISO.
Right. So you're shooting at
and,
like
and
ISO 10,000 or something like that.
Yeah, sometimes it comes up like that, but I usually top it at 10,000 or maybe 6,400. I just
Right.
had one photo that I got like for this season. It would have been my best photo, and so there's this pond like that wasn't frozen, so it's snow everywhere, and there's this bear in this area getting salmon by this river, and the pond is like just like 6 feet by 6 feet right beside the river, and so I want to get it reflected in the pond. And I set up the photo, and this bear comes into the picture, and it's almost perfect. The flash goes off, it lights up this bear, and then the bear ghosted, and you could see like the trees going through part of his body from behind. It was like really nice ghosting effect. But the flash was so bright, it washed out a bunch of the snow, and so it was like so close to be like a career-defining photo, but just a little fuck up. And I was like, oh man. And I kept trying to get that same photo with the bear coming back, but he just never came back to the exact same spot. Those are the
Oh,
worst. Like, like so close and you just can't get it again. But I'll keep
and
trying
it,
that one for years.
I'm curious, for images like that, do you ever use exposure blending to kind of deal with some of those mistakes?
I never have because like most of the work I'm doing is photojournalism. You can't use that stuff. And this is really interesting. I want to hear your thoughts on this. But like for me, I'm like a bit of a purist on photography. Like I think it's really important to trust photos, and so I wouldn't remove things from photos like distracting elements. I'll have some really great photos that can't really go anywhere because of one or two little pieces that are wrong with it. But I don't over kind of exaggerate anything like that. But I just think it's really important that people can kind of trust photos, and so I try to make it now so that people can trust my photos as being like an actual thing that was seen, and versus like like I've got a lot of friends who like they're capturing a mood with their photo, not like a scene. Like they're not trying to capture it exactly as it was, but more of a feeling. Where do like you do that nature photography contest, right? And that does it cover that kind of stuff a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, not to like beat a dead horse because we do talk about this subject fairly
Okay.
often on the podcast, but I've found that my views on this particular issue are fairly nuanced. A lot of people label me as kind of a purist for for right or wrong, indifferent, whatever. That word has for
Yeah.
some reason that word has a negative connotation attached to it, but I don't really perceive myself as a purist. I mean, that's why I asked you the question about exposure blending, because if that was my setup, I would be
Yeah.
really, really, really compelled to take like two exposures, one of the
Yeah.
bear
Yeah.
and then one of
Yeah.
the nice evenly lit foreground and all that, and just combine them.
Yeah. Yeah.
My reasoning being, because I'm with you, I want photography to be trusted, and I want it to be, I want people to believe that that's actually something that I
Yeah.
was able
Yeah.
to capture and photograph.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the technology has certain limitations attached to it.
Yeah.
And there's certain things you can do to overcome some of those limitations. So for the competition specifically, we have a whole set of rules and guidelines of what you can and can't do. But essentially, our main overarching rule is that the integrity of the subject must be maintained. And so, we don't allow you to like mix and match the best of both worlds in terms of exposures or
Yeah. Yeah.
focal lengths, things like that. We don't allow you to like add or remove objects within reason. Basically, in terms of removing of objects, if it's transient, like if it's a leaf that's on the thing and you don't like it, like, okay, that leaf won't be there tomorrow, so theoretically that's okay. But if it's like a big rock or a mountain or something that's more permanent, then no, you can't remove it.
Yeah.
So we have some nuance to our thinking around the rules, but the whole idea is to get people more excited and more interested in capturing images that, I guess, kind of honor the integrity of what the
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
was for the photographer. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and that means something for everyone, a little bit different, of course.
I know, and I'm still evaluating my stuff too with that photo. I'm like, yeah, like where do I sit? And it changes all the time, like where you sit with that kind of stuff. And as you age, and as it changes as a photographer, it's really tricky stuff to handle.
Well, and I would
I don't know where I
say,
always sit on everything.
I would say for someone like you who has a reputation of being a conservation photographer and a documentary photographer, I would think that it's a little bit more important for you to kind of stick to some of those ethical guidelines that your audience trusts you for. Like when someone looks at one of your
Yeah.
images, they know, like, oh, that Wolverine was literally there, and
Yeah.
he went through all these things to capture it. Versus, I don't know if you caught that that huge controversy last November with the snow leopard photos from that woman
Oh
from
yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that was a huge, like the snow leopard is like below Mount Everest, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
all these people did all this research and realized it was all fake and it was composited, and there was all these petapixel articles. I'll link to them in the show notes. But in that particular instance, it's problematic because one, they put the images out there as if they were real. Like they even on the first interview they did with petapixel, they denied doing any compositing. So right there,
Oh
like they're just
wow.
they were just being dishonest about the
Wow.
work,
Oh
which
wow.
to me is like that's the biggest problem. Like if you're
Yeah.
gonna create
Yeah.
stuff like
If you
that,
don't say anything. Yeah.
knock yourself out, right? But don't
Yeah.
don't be dishonest about it. I mean,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
but for someone like you, like you're known for more of these authentic moments in nature, and so I feel like if that's your reputation, then I think you should stick to it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting with that snow leopard stuff because just having context of being a wildlife photographer and knowing a lot about wildlife and where it would be and what it's doing, I saw those photos and I was like, that's incredible. And I would say like 5 seconds later, I'm like, oh yeah, that's not real. And like I didn't do any research on it. I just kind of saw it. I was like, oh, that's incredible. And then you're like, oh yeah, there's no way a snow leopard's going to be up in that deep snow, so high up in the mountain where there's no food. Like it's impossible. And then I
Right.
just didn't think about it again. I just kind of moved on. And then like a couple months later, I see all the stuff about it. I was like, oh yeah, I kind of figured. What was your story when you first saw it? Did you like right away? Were you skeptical? Could you tell pretty quick?
It's funny because I have found for myself that I am, or at least historically, I have been very quick to judge a photograph based on
Oh,
its
I see.
veracity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so my initial reaction was like, that looks really good, and I'm questioning it, but I'm not going
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
make any accusations.
Yeah.
So I belong to this Discord group, and we had this lengthy conversation about it. And one of the people in that Discord group happened to be someone who spends a lot of time studying the maps of that area of, of Tibet and Mount Everest and whatnot.
Yeah.
And he was
Yeah.
like pointing out all of these inconsistencies with the
Yeah.
photographs, and so I was like, okay, it doesn't look right. And then, of course, a week later, it all came out that it was completely just manufactured, and then, of course, turned into this huge debate and discussion about who cares, or like, oh, the photos are beautiful, so who cares if it was actually a real thing. It's like, I don't know if I want to go there, but I mean, most of the time when people see a photograph of a wild animal in a wild place, they expect it to be real. Otherwise, why wouldn't you just create like a painting or a digital creation of something?
Yeah.
Why are you trying to make it look as real as possible, right? So, and of course, the reason is because they want the person looking at it to believe that it was real. So,
Yeah. 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 That's a tricky one, in so many ways, kind of defining all that stuff. And yeah, it's fun.
well, and I've been accused by listeners of talking about this subject too many times. So,
Too many times. Okay, let's move on. That's fair. That's fair. You can go on to too much about anything. Let's get into politics. Let's talk about Trump and Biden.
no, no, let's not, because that is also another thing that people don't like. But actually, one thing I did want to talk to you about is, as someone who lives kind of on the front lines of climate change there in the Arctic, what
Oh
are
yeah.
some of the more notable impacts that you're seeing relating to the landscapes and the wildlife that you're photographing as it pertains to climate change?
I mean, essentially everything I do relates to climate change. Like every single thing I photograph has some climate change angle. I'm doing this story on, it's kind of a combined story. It's like there's these salmon that come up here and they arrive in winter, and there's these bears that fish these salmon in winter, and so it's like, 30 degrees below freezing, and the bears are fishing for salmon. They get covered in these icicles. And I started by, when I was doing this story of photographing these salmon, I went to this one river and I just kind of found it where it was. And it's kind of unique that we can find these places up here. So I found these salmon. There's about 20,000 salmon in this small river. And I figured there's like 25 grizzly bears in the area feeding on them in winter. And so I'm trying to photograph them. And this was when I first started the story, and it didn't really catch on. Like I didn't kind of like jump right in. It was one of these stories I slowly worked into. That was 10 years ago. And then the last 3 or 4 years, I've really focused on this story. And I went back to the same spot every year. And in the last 3 years, there was like 400 salmon one year, 200 salmon, and then this year there was 80. And so it went from like 17,000 salmon to 80 salmon. And then it went from 24 grizzly bears to like two or three kind of struggling grizzly bears. And so that's like, so many stories are like that. Part of it's climate change, part of it's overfishing. It's really hard, like, to define, like, to put the blame on one thing in our world. Like there's so many things that affect it, but one of them is definitely climate change, because one of the rivers that feeds this river, the glacier backed up and the river went in a different direction. And so the areas where the salmon spawn are usually in these sloughs, like the backwaters, and the river dropped like 2 feet, so the sloughs disappeared. And some of the salmon spots, they used to be great salmon spots, but we'd have a lot of like gold mining up here. And, like back in the 80s, if you wanted, you could just like take this river and shift it a kilometer to the side so you could mine the bed of it. And like you'd get fined like $5,000, but you would wipe out like 10,000 salmon. So like that's not climate change, but like, that's kind of related to the same story, how there's all these different causes. And I just, every single story I see it in. Another neat one, because they're kind of like, there's some neat components to these stories too that you learn, is like the caribou. Like we have these huge caribou herds in the north. One of our caribou herds is the healthiest kind of caribou herd in the north. It's 200,000 caribou. It's called the porcupine caribou herd. It kind of goes between Yukon and Alaska. And it's like the one caribou herd that's like not struggling across the north, which is really cool. But one of the concerns that the elders have, the First Nations elders, the Gwich'in indigenous people who've lived with these caribou forever, and they kind of talk about this stuff, is like forest fires. They're starting getting forest fires up in the area where there's no trees. It's just like bushfires. and they were talking about some of these stories that elders were telling me. And they're like, the reason we're worried is because, caribou, they often won't go to a certain area for 40 or 50 years. So they have these huge ranges. Like the range of this caribou herd is like the size of Scotland. So there's this huge range that they can go to. And they don't remember the trails if it's 40 years since they've been there, because there's no caribou alive that have been there. It's like 10, 15 generations ago. But they can smell where they went. And so, because they leave hair everywhere when they go, and so the old caribou can smell these old roots and they'll follow. And then the elder was telling me, like, the caribou, like, they smell through their feet, and you're like, what? That's crazy. They smell through their feet. And so they follow these old, roots. They're not even trails anymore, by smelling like through their shins and their feet, where the previous caribou have gone. And if a forest fire comes, it wipes out all that knowledge, because all that fur that was been left and has been sitting there, and that smell is gone, like after 50 years, but it's really neat. And then I just kind of like skews into another kind of neat story, is like all these stories you hear from the First Nations elders. You always hear like stuff like that, and you're like, that doesn't fit with our, you're like, could that possibly be true? And I always hear these stories, and within, you're always like wondering, I wonder if that's true. And within like 10 to 30 years after hearing these stories, some scientist comes out with a report, and which is exactly what happened about this caribou smelling through their shins. Some scientist comes out with a report, and you find out like it's been confirmed by science, and it just, there's so many times where you hear these cool stories from First Nations elders, and they're hard to believe, but they're bang on, and it just, it's neat. It's really neat. But the climate change stuff is, it's tough. It's like, we got to address it. We got to fix some of that stuff. We have to do a better job with our planet, and I think we're doing better every year. But we still have to keep doing better every year and get better and solve climate, address climate change.
I would say that's one of the things that being in nature photography has really reinforced for me, is just how interconnected everything is in the environment, whether it be weather patterns or fires or habitat change or like patterns of wildlife migration. Like if you push one lever a little bit, then all those other things are going to get impacted. And so I think it's really cool that through your photography you're able to kind of shed a light on how those stories are all connected together.
Yeah. And I bet you'll find the same thing, but like, and I think Canada and the US are a little bit different in terms of this type of stuff, society-wide. But like when I was first doing these stories, a lot of it was like educating people about the effects of climate change. But I don't do much of that anymore, because everybody knows about the effects of climate change, and it's just whether people want to make that sacrifice, within a larger society to address it. So I don't find I'm like educating people on climate change so much anymore. I'm still including in the stories, but it's not like as big as it used to be, because like everybody knows, okay, climate change is a big issue for a lot of things. It's just people aren't sure, like maybe how to address it or if to address it. Maybe those are the things. But like, so a lot of my role as like convincing people that climate change is real and it's having effects, that education's been done in Canada. People know that, so like that role that was a big part of my job and my mission has been filled now. And so now I'm kind of like looking at different, aspects and ways of telling stories, and like, the importance of like the salmon, like, it's not just climate change. We've got to address a lot of stuff to bring the salmon back.
Well, maybe on a more uplifting note, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your limited edition fine art photography books. Kind of what kind of books do you have? What's in them, and why should people be interested in those?
Yeah. Well, I got to ask you, have you done a book?
Not of my own work. Well, I have a published. It's not a photography book, although it has lots of photos in it. It's a climbing and hiking guide for the San Juan Mountains here in Colorado.
Oh yeah.
But
yeah.
Through the competition that I help run, we've published. Well, by the time this podcast comes out, we will have published our third book. So we've done 3 books, and they're like 220 pages. They're big, they're thick, they're high end.
How many did you make?
1,000, yeah.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah. Well, like we just did our first book. It was on this project about the bears. That covered icicles and the salmon. So I worked on that for 3 years, and and then we made a book too. And it was really hard to kind of figure out what to do with the book because I just wanted to make 125 copies, and then
You're right.
and it cost us like $100 per copy to make. So like we're selling it for around 200 US. You can't sell more than 125 either. And so it's a real like a really tight margin. You can't sell it in a store because if you sell it in a store, if I paid $100 to make it, I make $100 profit. The store's got to make 200. So you're trying to sell this book in a store for $400. It's like impossible. And
Right.
so it's just I'm just kind of getting into this, getting into this idea of publishing books and trying to figure out different ways to do it because I love books, but it's like also like it seems like the industry is going away from books in a lot of ways. I remember growing up as a kid learning photography. I just had like I have like maybe 4 dozen books in my house, but when I go and talk to young photographers nowadays, they don't have books lying around. Like it's
Right.
kind of changing. You can get all your, so much inspiration off the web that we used to get off of books. But yeah, so I got a book. If like it's a collection of photographs of these bears and salmon. If you're interested, check out my like Instagram at Mather Peter. Send me a message. I'll send you some photos from the book, and I'm just kind of selling it out of the house. I don't even have it on my website up yet, but I'll get up eventually. I just kind of wanted to talk about that whole concept of publishing books and seeing what you thought about it, like because you got some experience in that too, and I'm new to all this. What you got thoughts on all that stuff?
Oh, lots of them. I mean, it's a numbers game because what people don't realize is when you're printing lithographically in the way that you kind of have to for a book, the biggest expense is actually creating the aluminum plates that are used to create the image on the
Yeah,
plate on the press. And
yeah,
so that's probably at least half of your expense right there is just those plates getting created. And then the more books you can add to how many get printed is going to lower that cost of production, the paper and the binding and all that stuff. It adds to the cost, but it's way, 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 way less expensive than that initial investment of just creating the plates. It's funny because I was in this conversation the other day where people were like, I feel like $80 is too much for a nice photo book. And it's like, have you ever looked at the math of actually producing your own book,
yeah,
self-publishing a book?
yeah,
Even if you created 1,000 copies of a book, you're looking at minimum $25,000 to $30,000 investment.
yeah,
And so for you to even break even, you have to sell 315 books. And that doesn't even include your time, doesn't include shipping, it doesn't include storage, it doesn't include any of the materials you have to buy for, shipping stuff out. It's expensive if you want to do it right. And so, you have to get really good with spreadsheets. And you have to have an audience. You have to have an audience of people who are willing to spend 50 to at least $50. I feel like that's kind of the like if you're not
yeah, yeah,
unless your book is really
yeah,
thin, that's
yeah,
another way you can save on costs is just not have a lot of pages, which I
yeah,
feel like that's a new model people are moving towards is to have maybe 60 to 100 pages. So his upfront investment is, maybe half. So he can maybe spend 10 to 15,000 on a book and then break even after selling maybe 150, right? So there's different models for it, I guess.
I had someone who came at me like to kind of distribute books locally, and they wanted to sell them for $20 a piece, very thin. And like there's the profit margin for me because he would be distributing them would be like every 3 years I'd get like say 6,000 or $5,000.
Oh,
And
yeah,
it's like wasn't a great return, and it's like it can reflect poorly on you as an artist too if you're kind of like producing. So, like in the end, I said I'd be interested in doing a bigger book, selling for more, but it was outside of what he would want to sell books for, and it's tricky, man, because like it took me a long time to decide should I do this like cheap version of the book or is it kind of like does it screw up my like what do you call it, my brand, does it screw my
right.
brand if I've got a cheap book out there, and in the end I was like it's not worth it for like $2,000 a year.
Right. I mean, I was thinking about my mountain climbing book, which I did not self-publish. That's through a publisher.
Yeah.
And even that book, it's like, I think they made 20,000 copies. They sell for like $30. I think when one of them sells, I
Wow.
make like $2.50 or something like
Yeah,
that. You know what I
yeah.
mean? So,
That's
yeah.
crazy. 20,000 copies?
Right. But I mean, it'll
Wow.
be in print for a while. So,
I have a guidebook like yours, but it's for paddling, canoeing in the Yukon.
oh, yeah.
And and we did 3,000 copies, and it took I think 12 years to sell out because like our population's like 40,000 people, you know.
Yeah, I imagine mine will take a while to sell out because
20,000, that's
I'm.
crazy.
It's a lot of copies, and I want to. I can't remember the statistics. The publisher sent me a like, here's how many we sold this year. I want to say it was like 700 books or something. It wasn't crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty good, man. That's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there's so many different models. I mean, there's also another model people are moving towards now is like zines. Like a little bit lower quality, less pages, a little bit less refined, kind of more edgy,
It's like a
lower
magazine.
cost. Yeah, like a magazine almost,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
your upfront cost for producing something like that is, I mean, I haven't looked into it, but I'm guessing it's, way less than a book. So it's like a lower risk, lower reward type of idea. So I mean, there's definitely tons of different avenues you can take, but I always think about no matter what you do, it's going to take time, right? So what is
Yeah.
your time worth?
Yeah.
That's really the
Yeah.
question people need to be asking themselves.
Yeah, like one of my business models that is different from like some of my friends is they do a lot of like small things that are worth money. They're selling like postcards and stickers and things that go on fridge magnets and selling at art sales and stuff like that. And I always thought like, you have to invest so much money to get back a little bit of money, and you have to sell all your product to make a lot. And it was like when I actually figured out how many hours I was putting in, I'm like, wow, that's really low return. So I went to simple. I was like, I just sell big prints, and I'll sell a lot less every year, but I'll put a high profit margin on, and then my actual like hours to pay works out a lot better that way than doing it through the craft
Exactly.
sale, art sale time. It's a pretty tough go. I know some people make it and do great at it, but I think you got to kind of commit to that entirely.
Yeah, and you have to be willing to deal with a ton of inventory, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
no thank
ton,
you.
yeah, yeah. And some of
It's
it's
like
just going to
people
go to
always like,
waste.
yeah, and like so many people for me they're always like, "Oh, do you have like a bunch of prints I can come look at?" I'm like, "No, I don't have like a bunch
Yeah,
of 12 by 18s just sitting around of that you can come by. Like
yeah.
I'm not going to invest thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for something that may not ever sell."
That's the good thing about having this little book is a lot of people are like, hey, like what do you have on hand? And I'm like, I got this book, and
Right.
so I make a lot of sales through that because people are looking to get something of my art, maybe as a present for someone or for themselves, and I don't have anything on hand, but I have this book, and then they come and take a look, and they're like, oh yeah, that'd be perfect.
When you think about it, a really, really high quality fine art photography book that's maybe got 200 pages, you've got, I don't know, between 100 and 300 images in there, depending on how it's laid out and format. $100 to $200 for something of that quality from someone that you really love, it's not really that much money if you start thinking about the value
Yeah,
proposition of what you're
yeah,
getting. So at least
yeah.
that's my thinking.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm in the same boat too. Like for somebody who I really like their work and their art and what they're doing in the world, I have no problem paying that to like, have around my house that I can look through and enjoy.
Exactly. All right. Well, I got one more question for you, Peter. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some people that we should learn more about?
Yeah, mine's like a lot of northern people. I got a buddy up here. His name's Sonny Parker. He's from Haynes Junction. It's an even smaller town out here, doing a like long-term project on sheep.
Oh,
Wildlife guy, really neat guy, really nice person. He's one. I got a kid named Caleb Charlie. He is this guy who I'm working on a lot of projects with. He's like a bit of a filmmaker, but he's like a Gwich'in kid. He's a First Nation kid. He lives in northern Yukon in a community you can only fly to, and he lives where all the caribou come through, like they migrate through, and he wants to have a career as like a Planet Earth, BBC Planet Earth filmmaker. He's got an interesting story. Katie Schuler, she's based over in Maine. She does some really cool work. Has got good stories, and is just a nice person too. And she's working on a story about or a movie about game farm photography, and so
Oh,
she'd be really cool to talk to.
yeah,
And then
that's fascinating right there.
yeah, it's really fascinating, and I got to see a sneak peek of her movie. Yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. I think they're still in the process of making it. And then there's a guy who runs, yeah, you know, Summit Workshops, photo
I
photography
don't.
workshops.
I don't.
They're like a big workshop company, and I work for them every now and then. But the guy who like leads it all, his name's Chris Stepik, and he's a character. You know, he's like one of those guys who, you know, what's those people who you they enter a room and like you know, like they just have that energy that you're like, I want to get to know that person. So he'd be a fun interview. I think your audience would like enjoy listening to him tell some stories. Those would be my main guys.
Awesome. Well, this has been super fun, Peter. I loved hearing about your projects, your stories, your background, and I just wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to sit down and chat.
Yeah, thanks, man. I like hearing about what you got going on too. You're doing some interesting stuff, and that hike sounds like I wish I could hear more about it.
Yeah, well, I did a whole podcast episode on that, so you can check that out for sure. How do people learn more about your photography? Where should they go?
Right now, the best place is Instagram. So it's at Mather Peter, Mather, and we're updating the website, but it's probably 6 months away. So the best is through Instagram.
Perfect. All right, Peter. Well, thanks again. I love chatting.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, well, thank you to Peter for joining on the podcast this week. I had a great time speaking with you, and I wish you the best of luck with your incredible projects. I am quite inspired. I recently had the opportunity to witness a pack of wolves doing their thing in Yellowstone, and it was an incredibly powerful experience. It made me want to work on a project to showcase their story. Maybe someday. Before we part ways, I want to get some feedback from you about an idea that I had to expand the podcast. My idea is to do mini episodes halfway through the week that feature me talking about a hot topic or sharing a story from our community. Would you be into that, or does that sound silly? Let me know your thoughts. Just write to me at matt@mattpaynephotography.com and use the subject podcast idea to let me know your thoughts. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.